Alrighty, welcome everyone to our last session of the series. It has been an incredible 3 days. There has been a lot. We've had a lot of sessions, a lot of speakers. So kudos to all of you that are still with us, still joining this last session. My name is Megan King. I use she, her pronouns. I am one of the three organizers of this event. And I'm just so happy with how this series has gone. It has been an incredible experience this year. So thank you to all who have participated. So for our last session of the day, you of course get the final run through of all of the housekeeping. This session is being recorded. We're going to post all of the slides and the recordings by early next week. You will be able to find those recordings on Whova within each of the sessions, just like you've been clicking into live, as well as on our website, which is wapc.org. Be on the lookout over the next week for a follow-up survey where we're going to ask you all sorts of things about how the series went for you, any suggestions that you have for next year, including topics, speakers, etc. So please fill that out. We want to make sure that next year's series is just as good, if not better, than this year's. Other housekeeping items, please ask your questions in the Q&A. Dr. Phillips will answer those throughout his presentation today. If you're watching through Zoom, you can enter your questions into the chat box. We have that enabled for you. That is it for housekeeping. I am so excited to turn the session over to Dr. Phillips. He started our day and he's going to end our day now. I'll quickly run through his bio before I hand it over to him with his slides. So Dr. Phillips is board certified in internal medicine and toxicology for over 30 years. He is our executive and medical director at the Washington Poison Center. In addition to his position at our organization, Dr. Phillips continues to work as a hospitalist at Providence Mount Carmel Hospital in Colville, Washington. As a fellow of the American College of Physicians, the American Academy of Clinical Toxicology, and the American College of Medical Toxicology, Dr. Phillips is dedicated to ongoing education and teaching. Focusing on environmental toxicology and health risk assessment, Dr. Phillips has authored over 200 articles, chapters, and abstracts, as well as several textbooks on medical toxicology. Dr. Phillips, thank you for closing out our series this year. I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. It's always great to have the closing session and be here and send us on our way. So nothing to declare today. It's a bit of a fun lecture, but sad in a way, to talk about the economics of drug abuse. And so we're going to talk about precursor chemicals, the fentanyl, as far as their economic pathways to the United States, the flow of drugs, money, or commodities that are exchanged, distribution patterns of drugs in the world. But I think most importantly, it's important to know that I'm not an expert on transnational crime or cartels. I'm but a humble physician here. So, and I'm not an expert in macro or microeconomics. But I think one thing that's important to remember here is this is a subject matter that's very fluid. You heard Dr. Kaiser talk briefly about how things are changing rapidly, and many of our other presenters talk about that. And that it really includes everything from prices to distribution, different revenue streams, profit concepts, particularly when it comes to cartels. And so it's a very rapidly changing area, but it's interesting to know some of the flow. I think one of the things that we should sort of think about is a lot of our points of entry for substances come through our southern border. And this just gives you an idea about some of the ports of entry that come into Mexico and how they're then flowed and routed through that country, ultimately to ours. Now, I was going to show you a picture of the different cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco cartel, the two main actors right now in Mexico and South America. And it's such a changing geographic distribution. There's merging of cartels, there's turf battles to gain control. And so it's not really worth knowing where they come from, more about learning how they function in this whole thing. I think the other concept to think about is money laundering. And money laundering is just a way of, okay, you get the drugs into the country, we all get that, but how do you get the money back out of the country so it's not routinely through banks, or it's not taxed, things like that. So if you follow this slide, it goes through 6 steps. And step 1 is where the transnational organized crime units ship drugs into the country. And then ultimately that's sold for cash. And so you have bulks of cash. That cash is then distributed to many different cash businesses, essentially. A lot of that has to do with restaurant businesses. That tends to be a common one. That cash is then deposited and collects in there. The restaurant then make purchases, and I'm just using restaurants as an example. They make purchases and goods from Mexican merchants using credit cards, and of course the Mexican merchants are cartel owned. And then surprisingly, no goods are shipped out of the country, but the payment for the goods is shipped out to the country with a company credit card. So then ultimately the monies arrive back in the host country. So this is an example of how money laundering is done in a simple thing. And really, it's any cash intensive business like restaurants, but retail, cigarette, liquor, vending machine, parking garages. It can be really anything where cash is exchanged as the primary media of commerce. So we think about drugs for cash, but it's really a lot more than that. One of the big barriers is that we can train dogs to sniff for cash. So on the southern border of the United States, the border agents actually have dogs that will sniff for cash on the outbound lanes for drugs coming in and for guns and cash going out. And that's really hampered the way that money leaves the country. And so it often leaves by these other cash businesses. One of the things that happens is not only retail, like clothing stores, which are big, and you've seen some of that with some of these organized incidents where groups of people will go into stores and vandalize clothing and leave in a very organized kind of way. But it's also a really high-end thing. It's artwork, it's expensive cars that are shipped out of the country, all the same thing, and then they can be converted to cash at a later point. So drugs are going in, certainly cash is coming out in truckloads, literally, but it's also being converted into many different assets. This is an example of cash is king, and this is one seizure of $2.3 million that was found in a building in Mexico. That's a lot of cash. So cash is still the most important way to get money out. But there's lots of ways the cash can come out, right? It can cross the border. This is a picture on the left is from JFK Airport, where cash was concealed in different medications containers. And picture on the right is at the border crossing between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, where cash was strapped to the legs of an individual smuggling money that also have cash limits of how much can be brought into the country, much like the United States does. And if you think about other things, we talked about arts, of course, antiquities, coins, gold, precious metals, vehicles, yachts, all kinds of things. And this is really referred to as trade-based money laundering. So we're taking drugs, putting them in, and trading it for other goods that have value that can come out of the country. So it's a big problem, and it's not just drug and overdose issues. It's quite a mix of different things. It's also violence, it's economic problems, it's corruption, it's some terrorism associated with it. dramatic pollution from a lot of these lab sites that create this. And so it really creates a very large problem worldwide. And of course, not surprisingly, a lot of this happens at some of the busiest border crossing in the United States. And you can see that San Ysidro and El Paso are the two biggest border crossings. So this gives you an idea, but you can also see New York and Michigan. And in fact, right here in Washington at Blaine, there was almost 300,000, almost 332,000 crossings in March of 2019. So that's pre-COVID, and obviously these numbers took a big change, but they're approaching back to similar numbers now. So the busier the border crossing, the easier it is. It's a volume game, and so it's easier to get things through. If you load up 3 vehicles and you get one across, it's a success. So transnational crime, this is a slide from I think this is from World Bank, actually. And it talks about the estimated value in dollars worldwide. And counterfeiting is the biggest, but drug trafficking is right behind it. Surprisingly, illegal logging is close behind that. And human trafficking. And actually, human trafficking has taken a dramatic leap and is actually more profitable to many of the cartels currently than is drug trafficking. So crude oil theft, weapons, cultural property like antiquities being smuggled, trading in the wildlife and smuggling animals, anything that can be translated or transformed into cash is an important thing. So we have some retail prices of drugs, and these are just estimates. And for example, fentanyl prices have plunged dramatically in some areas down to 87 cents kind of range per pill. But it sort of varies with time. And so when I said initially that a lot of this changes, drug prices change dramatically. And I'll talk a little bit about how that happens. But this gives you some idea about the retail price of a kilogram. And you can see from this, and the point of this slide is that fentanyl per kilogram is a very profitable commodity. That for a kilogram of it, 2.2 pounds, you're getting about $1 million in sales from that. So a kilogram is anywhere from, depending on the estimates and how much is included, and these are rough, DEA estimates anywhere from 1 million to 1.5 million doses per kilogram. If you use it based on the number of micrograms per dose, it can get as high as 1 billion doses. So essentially, it's a lot of doses for a small volume. So if we then turn this around and think about, well, what's the 5-year drug cost for addiction? And this sort of omits healthcare, crime, lost wages, family issues, and everything. Just the cost of drugs. You can see this is kind of where we're at, and it really puts things in perspective. So some data cautions here. Obviously, the source of price estimates change and prices change. It's very geographic, the price of different things. The different formulations is different. For example, crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. There's about a 5-fold difference there. Geographic location. Obviously, if you're close to the border, such as El Paso, it might be $60. However, in Dallas, not that far away, it jumps immediately to 100. So drug prices, for example, in the Northeast of the United States are perhaps the highest. Well, price versus purity is an interesting concept. In Guatemala, it's about $12 a gram for 80%. In the US, it's about $90 a gram for 56%. And then Canada, about $51 a gram for 68%. And part of this has to do with how products are stepped on as they get from the source country or source of production to the retail selling of the item. So it might be stepped on several times, and stepped on essentially means using some of the adulterants that Dr. Kaiser went through so eloquently in the last lecture. Here's an example of a cocaine product that was marketed back in between around 2012, 2013 got started. But this drug, this cocaine variant was called High Heat. And that was the particular brand that they were selling with this cocaine. And there was a lot of hype that it had such high purity and high excitement. And you actually can see the price per gram is in red, and the purity is percent in the blue. And the purity is on the right Y column there. So you see the purity, didn't change dramatically, 50, 60% kind of range, but you can see the hype around September 2012 really jumped the prices up dramatically. And then it has gone down significantly, almost $100 a gram in that time frame. So this is part of the marketing influence that goes with substances. If we kind of stick with cocaine a little bit, a lot of the cocaine, about 93%, and you can fingerprint this by genetic markers and chemical markers of what you're seeing. And most of it comes from Colombia, some from Peru, some from Bolivia, and some from Ecuador. And then there's a small slice that's unknown, which are the other countries. We're going to talk more about Ecuador and cocaine as we go along here. It's become a real hotbed of activity for cocaine. And so most cocaine is not grown in Ecuador, actually. It comes really from Colombia, Peru, as we showed you. But perhaps the largest exporting center for cocaine is now in Guayaquil. And my apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I am positive I am pronouncing it wrong, and I apologize for that. But they ship about 300,000 containers a month, shipping containers out of the port there. And the port's a little bit inland, and you have to go down the river, and a lot of that is taken by smaller boat out to the larger ships. But they only inspect about 20% of the containers. Now, one of the sad things about this is that both the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartel are on-the-ground financiers, along with a group from the Balkan states, and they're referred to as the Albanian Mafia. Three main groups that are responsible for the cocaine transportation and exportation there. There's also lots of local gangs, the Croneros, the gangsters, the Big Feet, the Patones, and they all work for Sinaloa, while the Tiguerones, the Wolves, and the Cone Killers are aligned with Jalisco. And so there's local gangs, but the Mexican gangs of Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels are the main driving factors. And so they move from Mexico to include their cocaine base coming out of Ecuador. So if you're kind of paying attention, late July and August, there's been 2 murders in Ecuador. One was a presidential candidate in just about 6 weeks ago. Fernando Villasancio, who was running for election. He was at an event in the city and was killed by some individuals on motorcycles who sped away. They were captured, identified to be local gang members that we mentioned. And then also there was a former mayor in Manta, who was also assassinated in February. But this is all partly to get control of the cocaine business. And more importantly, it's to get control of the port itself. to export these products. And this is a findings of cocaine. These are all kilogram bricks of cocaine you see in this picture here at the base. Most of these exports from Ecuador go to Australia and Europe. That's the primary site. And you can see here on this picture, the port, the city up here, they come down the river. Small ships come, or small boats come around here. They load to larger seagoing vessels, and then off it goes to distribute around the country. So unfortunately, Ecuador has been drug into this quite violently in recent years. Well, you know, it doesn't just get put in shipping containers. You know, cartel members will place large containers attached to the bottom of ships so they're not visible, and they do this with magnets. And this is some police officers checking for that. They also attach this to the bottom of shipping containers with magnets on the bottom so they're underneath and they're not as visible. So it may not always be in a container, it might be under a container, under a ship, under a truck as well. So you can see here that this slide only goes to August of 17, but it just shows a remarkable increase in cocaine production as well as cocaine deaths going up. So cocaine has seen a rapid rise back again in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years, really since the beginning of COVID. It has not quite reached the 1990 levels, but it's getting close, is my understanding. We also look at coca bush cultivation by country, and the blue is in Colombia, the red is in Peru, and green is in Bolivia. And so you can see that primarily it's increasing in Peru and Colombia, the cocaine production. And these are in tons seized. So this is only based on seizures. It's not based on actual number of plants. So it's quite a lot. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something we all see every day and are maybe tired of hearing about. And that's fentanyl. And fentanyl really comes into our country in 2 ways. It either comes to our continent in precursor form, or it comes to us in final form. There's been a market increase in pre-manufactured fentanyl coming from India, while precursors are still mostly coming from China, but also lesser amounts from India. India is just sort of cutting out the middleman and going right to creating fentanyl in some of their labs there. This then gets shipped by some method, airlines, ships, boats, people. There's buyers, and either independent buyers or organized transnational organizations like the Sinaloa cartel, and then gets into wholesalers in the United States, of course, and then down on the street level for retail distribution. So this is kind of the process of how they flow through the country. But in the last 2 or 3 years, India's production of finalized fentanyl has really become an issue. And it flows through Mexico, really through Manzanillo and Laredo. Cardenas are the 2 main ports where the products come into Mexico, both precursors and some of the final forms. And this is also an issue, just like Ecuador. You know, we would expect to see the same. You'd see violence in each of these port cities. The idea is to control for ownership of the port. So mayors of these cities are being targeted, political leaders are being targeted, lots of gang violence in these, cartel-on-cartel violence in these areas. You look at fentanyl seizures, no surprise, they tend to be around urban environments or border areas, particularly in Southern California, border areas. And this is just for fentanyl, of course. If we think about, and this is both Sinaloa and Jalisco cartel and how they move this. And there's just sort of different theories about how it comes in, but we know based on intercepting products either by the Mexican Navy or the United States Coast Guard or Navy in international waters, there's some idea about ports of destinations or port of lading for these things. So the widening reach of fentanyl, if we look at fentanyl alone, and these are in forensic exhibits, in other words, seizures, you can see that there's still some fentanyl plus heroin in some seizures, but mostly it's increasing fentanyl. Now, remember around 2015 is when fentanyl really started to be imported in the United States. And so that's really taken a logarithmic increase since this time. If you go to the second tier, fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, you see also that the number of forensic visits, in other words, the number of seizures has gone up. Fentanyl and cocaine, fentanyl and opioids showed a larger range there right around 2015. As Dr. Kaiser showed you, a lot of the labs are not exactly the most sterile environments. I will tell you that there are some high-level chemists that are involved at the very tip of these corporations, but when it comes directly into the lab themselves, it's really people with less chemistry knowledge. I would point out on this site, though, this is a cleanup actually, and that's why these people are in Tyvek suits and you can see the characteristic purple filters on their full face respirators that are HEPA filters here. But it's an example of what they might see. Of course, there's all the fentanyl analogs, and this is just a game of potency versus mass. We see most of it is fentanyl, but we also see fluorofentanyl as well in the red orange slice of the pie there. But there's lots of different fentanyl analogs that are out there, and these are just from 2017. So, and again, the idea is because it's so potent that you don't have to smuggle nearly as much to get more doses for sale. So even though the price per pill is less, you still get a lot more pills out of it. Heroin is still around, but it's gone down in some of the Texas border areas. Del Rio, it's still up. This is an older slide, however, and this has changed dramatically since fentanyl has taken over. Heroin, you have to, process it from plants, and it takes a lot of time. It's a little bit more labor intensive, much like cocaine is labor intensive. But obviously fentanyl, you can create it in the jungle. You don't have to, you're just mixing things together, or you can create it in a factory type setting. You don't need to grow things. It's not based on crops. It's not something that can be seen from the air interdicted. So it's an easier thing. And we see a lot of the heroin that was coming into the country was really from Mexico. And you can see how that changed. A lot of it came roundabout from South America, some from Southeast Asia. And that's really essentially, this has gone away essentially to fentanyl. Fentanyl price purity, again, not much difference here in price purity over time, over the years. It's just a slide indicating where a lot of the fentanyl pathways come from for opiates. And this is no surprise. I think you've all seen these slides before. I think the other thing to realize is that packages that come through the US mail or other international carriers go through evaluation by DEA, ICE, Custom Enforcement, and they look at these packages both with X-ray machines and with sniffing animals, and they do a lot as far as interdiction, and it goes everything from fentanyl pills to steroids to pretty much anything you could possibly want and order on the light web and the dark web. Custom border protection seizures. This goes up to the year 2020, and you can just see how this changed over time. Cocaine doubled, heroin went down, marijuana went down because of legalization, methamphetamine more than doubled, and fentanyl skyrocketed, which is something we're seeing even more of now. When we think about transnational organized crime and how it creates instability in these areas, we're pretty familiar with how it interacts in South America, Central America, and North America. But this is also going on in other parts of the world. You know, it's going on in South Central Asia. It's going on in some of the Gulf areas. It's certainly going on in Africa because there's very little policing that's done and lots of corruption that can happen in certain areas there. And so it's important to realize this isn't just a regional problem. This is a worldwide problem that we're seeing. There's three examples of that we might all be familiar with drugs of abuse and economics. And the three are the book Freakonomics, the TV show The Wire that was on HBO, and of course Breaking Bad, which is the more recent version. And they're all quite interesting. Freakonomics is a book written by Steve Levitt and Stephen Dubner. Fascinating book, and chapter 3 delves deep into a Chicago crime organization that was selling cocaine that we'll talk about. And that chapter was called "Why Do Drug Dealers Still Live with Their Moms?" Kind of a catchy title. I like that. And a grad student that was working with Steve Levitt, Sudhir Venkatesh, who's now a full professor at Columbia, did his graduate study work on this gang and actually embedded with the gang with their permission to look at their business. And then they compared it to McDonald's based on an organizational chart and really found it very, very similar. And they looked at primarily the Black Disciples. You know, it's a gang that's been around since 1966. One of its founders, David Barksdale, which was also one of the last names, one of the main characters in The Wire that we'll talk about next. But he was called the boss or the king. And there was about 120 members of the Black Disciples that kind of sat at the top of the pyramid. But the base of the pyramid was really gigantic. And so the people at the top were paid very well, but others were not. For every, the 3 officers they had, there was about 50 foot soldiers and about 5,000 men working for those 120 bosses overall. And on top of that, there was about 20,000 people that were unpaid. And these were just gang members that just wanted to belong. They just wanted to be part of a gang. And if you looked at the amount of money they were making, the rank and file members were making about $3.30 an hour. And the 3 officers that were in charge under the bosses were making about $7 an hour if you looked at what this was. So it's kind of a surprising. So it's really that you need to be the top of the pyramid to make any kind of wage. And you also have to remember that at that time, slinging crack was a lot more dangerous than most menial labor. Members who were part of this gang for 4 years stood a 1 in 4 chance of being killed. And Chicago still has one of the highest murder rates that fluctuates year to year. It seems like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia are always in competition. Anyway, to be a gang member with the Black Disciples was about 5 times more deadly than being a timber cutter, which is, according to Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the most dangerous job in the United States based on mortality. So this is the working paper that they created in 1998, and it's quite fascinating to study that. And even if you just read the book Freakonomics, I highly recommend it. It's quite entertaining getting into microeconomics, the economics of drugs, for example. They have chapters on economics of names of people, what people name their children, and all kinds of things that are just fascinating. So The Wire, a bit of a brutal TV show, but it was extremely well written and acted. And it's used by multiple universities to teach urban economics and sociology. And essentially it was about the Barksdale organization versus the police in Baltimore. And the organization was led by Avon Barksdale and his assistant Stringer Bell. And part of this was turf wars with other gangs that led to decreasing quality of product and loss of territory of the Franklin Towers. And it's really interesting how the two characters differed on their approach. Avon Barksdale, his way to get back at these other gangs that were trying to take their turf was to hire hitmen and kill the other gang members. But Stringer Bell embodied the businessman in this, and he shows him taking classes in economics and figuring out how to boost profits. And he actually shows he got an A- on one of his papers in that economics course. And of course, more recently, probably many of you are more familiar with Breaking Bad, put out by Sony Pictures, with Walter White and Jesse. And essentially, this Breaking Bad is about methamphetamine, where The Wire is primarily about heroin. And it's really interesting as Breaking Bad evolves. It's not, if you don't know the story, Walter White essentially is a high school chemistry teacher that gets cancer and doesn't have really anything fortune saved up for his wife and child who has some impairments, and essentially decides to start making pure methamphetamine. And it's so pure that he and Jesse become obviously millionaires and stashing money. And ultimately they get to the point where they start to sell the precursors, the methylamine, instead of actually selling the meth itself, the crank. So also quite well done and worth a watch. So if we look at global drug trends, this little donuts that you see scattered throughout the globe, if you look at North America in the upper left, you see that we have an opiate problem. This is an older slide, so now the opiate ring is much larger. Cannabis is big, cocaine is big. South America, primarily it's cocaine, of course. If you go to Europe, primarily it's opiates. In Australia, Micronesia, Oceania. Africa primarily is cannabis and khat are two of the big things there, although they're right in the shipping lanes now, and so that certainly can change. So some drug abuse tends to be, we used to think of it as being very geographic in nature, where heroin was kind of a New York thing, methamphetamine was kind of a Los Angeles thing. Glue sniffing was a Denver, Colorado thing. And then this really changed a lot as cartels got involved in distribution networks with it. Well, one thing that I learned from the gang studies is the concept of compensating differentials. And this is an economic term. Essentially, it's like a shift differential. If somebody has to do a more unpleasant task, they should get paid more. And this is a quote that was in a study done by Steve Levitt in Freakonomics. And it said, if you want to stand around here doing all of this expletive that's going on, no, right? So if I'm going to be asked to put my life on the line, then than front me the cash, man. So this is a compensation differential that you see get paid for hazardous duty, but remember what they get paid. Remember, they think they're getting a lot of money, but this is in the $3 an hour kind of range. Well, what about supply side and the drug war? What about our drug war that we're trying to stop this? And it's kind of interesting when you think about it economically. The supply side drug war, we think about supply side economics like other kinds of economics. The more supply you have, usually the cheaper it gets. And we also think about increasing cost of bringing the drugs to the market. Well, the war on drugs essentially increases the cost of cartels bringing drugs to the market, right? They have to smuggle more, find more ways. They're building submarines. Their costs are going up in order to import their drugs. And so typically, higher prices kind of lower the supply and sometimes the demand. But the interesting thing about drugs, particularly ones that are physiologically habituating, is that they're not very sensitive to price. So consumers of particularly these addictive substances are likely to use about the same quantity regardless of the price, even in the face of very large price increases. And that's because illicit drugs are really referred to as kind of being price inelastic. They don't shift. Now, this doesn't really consider shifting drug potency like heroin to fentanyl, but if you look at the curve at the graphic on the side there, you see that the two lines that are sloping up, the supply lines, one with the drug war and one with the no drug war. You see the blue box. If you have a supply war, it actually increases the Q2. It increases the quantity. And this is exactly what really happens with fentanyl. And this explains a lot of the fentanyl death. We're just actually seeing a way around heroin. Hey, suddenly we can smuggle in this more potent product that's easier to smuggle in and people still like it. And we result in having over 100,000 deaths a year. And so this kind of explains economically kind of the same thing. The demand has not changed. It's gone there. Well, what about addiction versus drug control? If we look at addiction rates, and this is an older slide, versus U.S. drug control spending, the green area under the green line is how much we spend in that 40-year period of time on drug interdiction and control versus the U.S. addiction rate. And you can see that all the money we spend has not changed the addiction rate. Now, that's probably no surprise to all of us in this meeting today, but it puts a real visual on what has been happening. Methamphetamine, let's shift gears a little bit. Hotspots in the world are Asia and North America. And actually, Southeast Asia is a big hotspot, even with some of their death penalty laws regarding substance abuse. This is an example of methamphetamine that was found by a Malaysian customs official in Kuala Lumpur. This is an interesting slide that just sort of let us sit and think about this for a minute. This is how much we spend versus how many people are treated. So we see that way down here in the bottom of the curve, South Africa, Indonesia, Romania, they're not spending very much, and they're not treating very much. And you can see up here, the people treated for drug abuse per 1 million residents. We treat a lot of people, but we haven't dented that. And that's because of those economic patterns that I showed you there. Thailand's become a big player in this as well, particularly with stimulants. One of the big things for my colleagues that are viewing from Vietnam, we're seeing a lot of vaping of cathinones and cathinoids in Vietnam right now, and that's kind of the big stimulant. Vaping episodes that's going on there right now. So I think in summary, I want you to leave you with the idea that, this remains a very fluid process. Prices, types of drugs, distribution modalities, but addiction remains the same. Cartels are shifting their territory, their names, but they're still quite effective and becoming more violent. And of course, demand and supply. We know that there's still a tremendous demand, and there's a supply that's feeding that demand as well. So with that, I want to, the one message I want to leave you, I think one of the most important things, and I want to send a shout out to Dr. Allison Newman and stopoverdose.org, which I think is one of the most valuable websites you can see right now for overdose. And on this International Overdose Awareness Day, I want to thank you for your time today, and I appreciate your participation. So I'm going to stop my share now and
All right, everyone. If you have any questions, please either put them in Zoom chat or in Q&A on Whova. The only question that I'm seeing so far in Q&A is asking if Freakonomics is dated.
certain concepts are dated, sure. Yeah, it's closely dated. There's been, I think, 5 or 6 books that they've written, but all about different subjects. It's more that it kind of raises your awareness to think about economics in a completely practical way, how it touches all of our lives. And so while the numbers are very likely dated, and they've shifted dramatically, a lot of the control is organized from cartels directly with gangs as business subsidiaries. So yes, there are some big differences that are going on that would date it. General concepts would be similar.
And there's a comment here that the guys at Freakonomics actually have a series of podcasts out right now.
Yeah, they've had podcasts out for a very long time, and they're terrific. They're fun to listen to if you're driving. So they're very good.
So another question, is there any research that can inform how communities can make dealing less profitable?
I wish I knew the answer to that. That's kind of a criminology area that I'm sure there might be, because it's certainly something we're all faced with very commonly. They're seeing dramatic vandalism issues, organized vandalism issues in California. And we've even seen some in Thurston County area, not so much in Seattle yet, but I suspect it's coming towards us. And so I don't know about plans or methods to alleviate some of those potential crimes, but I would love to hear them if there's any law enforcement people on.
We have a question from Justin on what macro level policy change would you see as an intervention, as a possible intervention for this?
That's kind of the $1 million question, Justin. I again, I wish I knew the answer. I know that our goal is, in our title, it's prevention, it's harm reduction, and it's treatment. And that's important. And we have what appears to be a stable or rising number of people with substance use disorders. Part of that problem, of course, is potency, is harming people. But, how do we deal with that? It doesn't appear that spending a lot of money on law enforcement has changed it, although we don't know that. Maybe it has, maybe it would be a lot worse. That's something that's kind of unknown because how it interacts there. But I'm hoping someday that maybe there are things like vaccines that are being researched that we heard about 2 days ago. Things like that might help our fellow citizens that are suffering from these illnesses, that might help us.
And I think, just to add on to that, one of my favorite statements, I think, throughout this entire series was in the session on harm reduction with stimulants, where a question was asked on what was the most unconventional harm reduction strategy that they've seen that works. And their answer was unconditional love for the people who are using drugs in our communities. And I think that that is possibly the best answer to any question we've had this series.
I do like that. That's great. That's great.
Well, I am not seeing any additional questions come in. For those of you who are watching now, you are welcome to continue asking your questions in the Q&A, and I can pass them along to Dr. Phillips even after today's session ends. Otherwise, Dr. Phillips, I think you can move forward with your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. I'm really so happy. This has been such a fantastic session. So in closing, I really want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you who joined us for the past 3 days, contributing to the knowledge and sharing on prevention, harm reduction, and treatment of overdoses. And once again, I want to recognize today as International Overdose Awareness Day, which is really the catalyst for the Washington Poison Center putting on these sessions, and this is the 4th year that we've done so. Our collective dedication to understanding and preventing, addressing this devastating impact to overdose is really truly inspiring, and I must say that all of our attendees and speakers have inspired me. And we have attendees from Namibia, from Vietnam, multiple people, Iran, Canada, and 26 states. And that included close to 600 people participated in this event, which is really terrific. And that's the largest so far. And it's my hope that, sharing our experiences, our insights, and our strategies has energized all of us to continue our campaign of understanding, preventing, and addressing substance use and overdoses. I am grateful to the 38 speakers who have been so generous with their time in preparing lectures and presenting their lectures and sharing their knowledge to teach us all new tricks, things that we need to learn and be up on. And your insight has really been invaluable. And I think we've all taken things away from this course. I know I have. And I think learning is really the only thing that doesn't get old. I think it's important to know that. Also, I want to throw in a pitch. I know just Alex did earlier that, as many of you may know, the Washington Poison Center is a nonprofit, and we rely on donations to keep serving the citizens and providers of the state of Washington and beyond. So if you're in a bit of a giving nature, please go to our website, which is wapc.org, and click on the donation link. And any amount, we very much appreciate it. It's hard to run a nonprofit and have such highly skilled and trained people. I do want to especially thank our educators, Megan King, Alex Saratsky, and Justin Malgrove here at the Poison Center for really creating such a terrific program and making it look effortless these last 3 days. It's really been terrific. And, we've heard stories that remind us of the lives affected by this issue, and that I think motivates me, and I think hopefully all of us, to continue towards some meaningful change and impact. And remember, the knowledge we've gained here and the connections we made are valuable resources that we can take back to our communities and continue to spread the word. And by fostering open dialogues, increasing education such as this, advocating for evidence-based solutions, which we've heard a lot of research that's being done the last 3 days, I think we can make a substantial difference and help the lives of those struggling with substance use and their loved ones and families. So fostering a dialogue, increasing education, and advocating are really goals towards prevention, harm reduction, and treatment. And I'm really looking forward to next year's session. I do want to recognize the people, the patients, and the families that we endeavor to help each day, and to thank you for trusting us to care for you. I think that's why we're all here. And I want to thank every one of you for your participation in the conference, and I'm moved by your dedication, concern, passion, and your caring ideals, and that you're sticking it out to the last day. And I want to leave with a short quote from Martin Luther King, a very brilliant person, who said, "You don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step." And I'd say over the last 3 days, we've all taken many steps together. And so until next year, steady forward. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips, and thank you to everyone who's attended. Again, please be on the lookout for that survey so that we can make next year even better. With that, I'm going to end the webinar and officially end our 4th annual series. Thank you all.
Thank you.